I would now move to Arno Behrens, who is a research fellow at the Center for European Policy Studies. And to remain a bit on this regional dimension, a regional approach has been a characteristic of the European policymaking in energy issues, probably since the third energy package. How does this fit into the current debate around the energy union?
Thank you, Marco, and thank you also to the organizers of this great event so far for inviting me and for this great panel so far. In my introductory remarks, I want to take a little step back to the kind of broader EU policy overview and focus mainly on 3 points. The first one is that despite all criticisms that we currently face around EU energy policy, we have actually come a long way. We can see that in several pieces of legislation that are currently in place, starting from the 2009 Energy and Climate Package, which sets a predictable and binding policy framework for climate and energy policy in the EU. And in fact, the 2020 targets will most likely be achieved. In this context, it's also important to mention, of course, the third energy package. We have discussed this before already, aimed at further liberalizing and integrating the EU internal market. And this third package sets an EU-wide institutional and regulatory framework with effective measures to safeguard competition. And the much disputed and discussed unbundling and third-party access are actually now in place, not implemented to the full extent, but we have a EU-wide policy on this. A third element of this achievement in energy policy is the energy chapter in the Lisbon Treaty, setting out concrete objectives for what the EU is actually trying to achieve with its energy policy in terms of completing the internal market, in terms of securing energy supplies, energy efficiency and renewables are another factor, and of course interconnection and energy networks, something of high relevance also to this conference here. So the EU basically now has a shared competence in all these 4 areas, and this means that member states can actually only legislate once the EU has not done so. So I would say a big achievement. I don't want to list all the EU policy initiatives now, but maybe last but not least, what we have achieved after a series of gas crises is actually that the EU has been prompted to put in place legislation aimed at guaranteeing at least a minimum standard of security of supply, both by putting in place the a kind of security of supply standard, the N-1 standard, which is quite an important achievement actually to have such a standard on the EU level, but also all kinds of crisis response mechanisms, preparation mechanisms, or even a better integration of networks, including reverse flows. So, this just as the background, and really what you would think when you hear all this is really that this would be a good basis for integrated, competitive, liquid, and possibly resilient EU internal market driven by the EU emissions trading system. But actually, the situation in 2015 is a different one. And this brings me to my second point, that despite all the achievements that we have on the EU level, the EU energy system remains fragmented. And I want to quote Jacques Delors, former Commission President, who said that we kind of have lost the European drive, to overcome differences and to find strength in a common vision or a new project. Now, maybe this is a bit of a negative statement, but if you look at it, it actually applies to many issues, including the internal market, like the internal side, but also on the external side, and how Europe acts or does not act collectively on the international scene. So why is this fragmentation? And much of this is actually due to member states having enshrined their independence over their own energy mix and natural resources in the Lisbon Treaty, in the Treaty on Functioning of the EU, TFEU. But it's more than that. It also relates to continuing tax sovereignty on energy matters, national economic and social policies that play a role in a kind of national approach, as well as continuing national responses to security of supply threats or perceived threats. The result is a mosaic of different national responses. Think about support for renewables, not just for renewables, now also for nuclear power in the UK with the contracts for difference. There are different capacity mechanisms being discussed. A host of different national taxes and levies on energy, and so this is a very fragmented picture that the policy in electricity markets shows. But this is also the case for the internal market legislation, which is still not fully implemented in all countries. And when we look at the gas sector, of course, another sign of the fragmentation is how we deal with Russia. Not to mention our, more or less cozy bilateral relationships in gas contracts with Russia, but maybe even worse, the fact that some member states are actually trying to undermine internal market legislation for, national interests, or at least perceived national interests, and the South Stream project has been an example for this. So, what has been done? Giving a new impetus to a European drive in energy policy, the new Commission has presented the Energy Union process, as Julian has said, which is essentially aimed at creating a coherent and overarching policy framework aimed at preventing further renationalization of energy policy, I would say. So if you want to give a negative interpretation of the Energy Union, you can say that this is really a symptom of an EU integration crisis. But maybe on a more positive note, it's also an important sign that energy is actually now back on top of the agenda and is actually part of the EU's mission statement today. It is a great chance for the EU to actually develop a credible strategy on how to achieve the EU's greenhouse gas emissions reduction commitments, while at the same time safeguarding competitiveness and security of supply. But in order to be successful, it will need to answer concrete questions, and in particular, we'll have to deal with some of the trade-offs that exist. And in particular, I want to mention the trade-offs between the speed of building up renewable energy on the one hand, and creating the single market on the other. This is a trade-off that needs to be solved. Another one is how phasing out state interventions can be put in line with moving to a low-carbon electricity sector. So these are all kinds of issues that need to be solved on the big issue, but it's not just the grand scale. The devil also lies in the detail, as can be said. And despite the fact that the Energy Union is a kind of broad and maybe ambiguous concept, it should, every member state can find something in it for them in the Energy Union. At the same time, the Energy Union has actually received its first setback with the rejection, or at least temporary rejection, of the energy security strategy in the European Parliament like 2 weeks ago. Why was this rejected? Basically because there was a proposal for a moratorium on fracking included, but there was also a proposal for continued state government support for nuclear energy. And basically these two very contentious issues have led to a majority of members of the European Parliament to actually reject this strategy, although, of course, there is broad consensus that the strategy itself is a positive development. So not just fragmentation among member states, but also fragmentation among European politicians, if you want. So finally, my third point, what can be done? Maybe the vision of an integrated, liquid and resilient and competitive EU internal market is a long shot for the time being. But maybe there's something in between nationalization or renationalization and full integration. And in this respect, the Energy Union concept has actually been instrumental in strengthening or putting forward the debate on enhancing regional cooperation as a stepping stone towards a single EU energy market. And in fact, if you think about it, this makes sense, because many of the cross-border implications of national energy policies are actually most evident on the regional level, given physical connections and market coupling and so on. So therefore, it would seem logical that regional initiatives may give a kind of more effective policy response to these issues at the appropriate level of governance, also in line with the subsidiarity principle of the EU. And there have been examples for such fora, such kind of regional fora that deal with these issues, and one of them is the Pentalateral Forum in Central Western Europe that, you know, on a voluntary basis is creating a framework to discuss these issues. But regional approaches can actually also go beyond merely, you know, information exchange and trying to, you know, give a response to cross-border implications. They can also be a possibility to actually align support for renewable energy sources or backup capacity and linking them to infrastructure development. This is actually quite relevant in the current debate about the 2030 targets and how to implement the renewables, the EU-wide renewables target on the national, or in fact, as I would propose, on the regional level, to have regional renewables targets that are kind of linked maybe also to regional infrastructure targets. And of course, the regional element can also play a role in security of supply. For example, through some kind of common purchasing mechanism for Eastern European countries in order to strengthen their position towards Russia, if this is necessary at all. This is, of course, a highly politically debated issue, but it has its benefits, its potential benefits. But to conclude on the regional aspect, whatever the regional arrangement could be, and however many regional arrangements we would have in the EU, it is very important that the European Commission actually stays in the driving seat of these arrangements in order to avoid a kind of regional fragmentation and to basically ensure that the regional cooperation mechanisms remain compatible with each other, among each other, but also with the EU internal energy market as a whole. So these are my 3 points for the discussion, and I look forward to the debate.